So the outcomes of the Great Migration were that you know see this mass change in demographics. Eventually 6 million African Americans will leave the South in these decades. You'll see that in northern cities, you definitely have better opportunities economically, more access to political opportunities, but still there is tremendous discrimination. And actually racial tensions get worse over time in many cases than better. And even though there may not be legal segregation like you see in the South, there's what we call de facto segregation. Meaning that there are just restrictive covenants that forbid Black Americans from, buying homes in certain areas, and they're isolated, and obviously missing out on a lot of economic opportunities. Now, the Harlem Renaissance, I think, was talked about pretty well in your reading and in the video. Go back and watch that clip again if you have forgotten it. But Harlem becomes really one of the major cultural centers of the United States, especially with its influence on jazz and the entertainment industry that it evolved there. Now, the Harlem Renaissance refers to this literary, artistic, and intellectual movement that helped foster a new kind of Black cultural identity that focused on pride and emphasis on Black artists. During this time, you also see, it's not just artistic. There's also a lot of active political movements. The NAACP is engaged in an active period of writing. And you see, actually around the world, more African American artists and politicians are getting international attention. So Langston Hughes is probably one of the most famous writers of the time, and I'm sure, or hopefully, all of you guys have read quite a bit of him in your English classes. So we said that Harlem was a center of entertainment, and this reminds us that the 1920s is frequently referred to as the Jazz Age. Jazz emerged through ragtime and blues music that came from the South. In the 1920s, jazz clubs and dance halls became really common, especially actually as speakeasies, illegal bars, started popping up. In Harlem, there are 500 dance clubs, and you may remember in the video that woman was saying that they would save up for weeks and weeks so that they could go out for one night. Now, going to these dance clubs and participating in dances like the Charleston became a nationwide craze for young people. A lot of people were really bothered by it. They thought it was quite radical that Black and white Americans were partying together, that men and women were drinking together, and it was seen as quite scandalous. The impact of the Jazz Age is that, you see it contribute to the popularity of the radio. Jazz contributes to a common national identity because it emerges in the United States, and it definitely helps create a youth culture and maybe even widens that gap between the generations. Now, a lot of people fear it. They think that jazz is somehow dangerous and that it's the symbol of the free manners and morals of the age. One guy says, jazz employs primitive rhythms which excite the baser human instincts. Jazz music causes drunkenness. Reason and reflection are lost, and the actions of the person are directed by the stronger animal passions. Now, somebody positively commented that jazz was an expression of the times, of the breathless, energetic, superactive times in which we are living. But others just could never get next to it. Reverend Culpepper said, dancing is a divorce feeder. It is heathen and animalistic. It degrades people. Now is the time to say plainly that it is one of the most evil of all modern customs. So dramatic. But other changes of the time, I know I'm kind of going through this quickly. If you have any questions, make sure you let me know. But make sure you know about the influence of cars and the emergence of suburbs. A lot of the urban areas had become crowded throughout the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, so people are starting to expand, and that's really made possible with buses and the personally owned automobile, because it's easier for people to travel. Now, Ford's Model T made them cheap. The impact of this is that it becomes a way to get away from it all. There's really a strong sense of individuality, autonomy, and freedom. You don't have to ask anyone if you're allowed to go from state to state. You can just go. If you go to the video on kazanashistory.weebly.com, it's the very top video. It gives you a little bit of review about the importance of Henry Ford and the automobile. it definitely helps fuel entertainment, sporting events, vacations, trips, and also it changes dating customs by creating an opportunity for privacy for lots of people. So, now, like I mentioned earlier, you know, people are, incomes have improved. I think I mentioned this earlier, actually. Incomes have improved. You see people were working 47 hours a week on average, and it drops down to about, 43 hours a week on average, and they're making more than they were before, too. So now people not only have more time, but they have a dispensable income. And they decide they want to spend it on entertainment. So you see things like the movies become really popular, Hollywood, where they have all of these sunny days and they can be filming all the time. You see tons of new theaters emerge. By 1930, there are 22,500 theaters. I think this is pretty notable. In 1929, ticket sales were at 90 million a week. And that's impressive when you think that there was only 125 million people in the nation. So a lot of people were going. The first movie was called The Great Train Robbery. In 1903, people had ducked thinking that the train was going to come at them and had been silent movies. But now you're seeing the beginning of talkies. So movies became a multi-billion-dollar business fairly quickly and have maintained that strength ever since. Newspapers and magazines become even more popular. They increase in size and circulation, and they become more risque than ever before. People also get pretty obsessed with the tabloids, kind of like TMZ, especially when you've got the gang wars that go on between Al Capone and other people. We'll talk about that in the next video. But there's a lot of new methods of and intensified use of advertising that you definitely see in newspapers and magazines of the time. Now, radio also becomes really popular. 40% of all homes have one by 1930. And the impact of that is that, you know, people are listening to the same jokes, the same commercials, the same sports events and news. They're even starting to develop some of the same accents. So all of these developments in media are significant because this is the beginning of a national and common culture versus like a regional culture. These are shared experiences. So at this point, you want to make sure that you can consider why someone would describe the 1920s as the age of play. You know, like what new recreational activities and entertainment had become popular, what allowed people to take part in these kinds of activities. But also note that many people are frightened by this roaring decade, and they really began fighting against the modernity, the diversity, and the loose morals of the flapper era. Some examples of fighting against modernity in the age of play. You read about the KKK and discrimination, restrictions on immigration, the Red Scare, the battle between science and religion, and then Prohibition. So we'll do a quick review of these, and then we'll be done here. This is a video clip on the KKK that you can watch on kazianashistory.weebly.com if you'd like. But here are just a few important reminders. A lot of people got this wrong on the quiz. In the South, in 1915, a movie is released called Birth of a Nation. I actually showed you guys clips of this. I don't know if you guys remember when we talked about Reconstruction. And what it did is it glorified the Klan and falsified the story of Reconstruction in the post-Civil War era. It presented blacks as trying to dominate whites and violate white women, and a lot of people shockingly took this as fact. They just accepted it as fact. And with the publication of that movie, the KKK came back really strong in 1915. Their membership was about 100,000 in 1922, but by 1924, their membership was at 4 million. Their focus, though, had shifted. It had broadened, you know. And the second resurgence, the Klan moved beyond just targeting Black Americans and broadened their message of hate to include Catholics, Jews, anyone who they deemed un-American or a foreigner. The Klan really promoted fundamentalism and devout patriotism, along with their advocating of white supremacy. Also, another thing that people often get wrong on the quizzes is their role in Prohibition. They usually supported Prohibition, actually. They were against forms of imperialism and getting involved with outsiders, and they supported the Democratic Party. So a few key things about the KKK that you'll want to keep in mind. Now, they do decline after 1925, after multiple scandals that occur in the late 1920s. Like the Grand Dragon, D.C. Stevenson, had assaulted a young girl who actually committed suicide. But it took that much, it took quite a bit to take them down, and they declined for a while in the 1930s, but would definitely come back even stronger in the 50s in response to the civil rights movement. Now, this is a primary source from the Klan Manual in 1925. It says, Klansmen are to be examples of pure patriotism. They are to organize the patriotic sentiment of native-born white Protestant Americans for the defense of distinctively American institutions. Klansmen are dedicated to the principle that America shall be made American through the circulation of American doctrines, dissemination of American ideals, the creation of wholesome American sentiment, and the preservation of American institutions. So see how they're advertising themselves as being patriotic, but obviously they have a corrupt interpretation of what American doctrines are and what American ideals are, and no recognition of the true history of the diversity of the United States. They're basically making it up as they go along, just like they are with the Reconstruction history. And they honestly look ridiculous. Like, look at this. Like, he looks like an elf. I can't take them seriously, but and at times they don't even take themselves seriously. Like, I found this source that said, we are a movement of plain people, very weak in the matter of culture, intellectual support, and trained leadership. It lays open to the charge of being hicks and drivers of secondhand Fords. We admit it. That was the imperial wizard of the KKK in 1926. But it's notable that racial tensions weren't only increasing in the South. They existed in the North as well. Race riots ensued. The summer of 1919 was called Red Summer because there was riots in more than 30 different cities. There's an optional documentary, again, on the Weebly page that's about the 1920s from America, the Story of Us, if you are missing that. And they talk about the race riots in a lot of big cities in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and other places. So one other point of clarification was regarding Marcus Garvey and the Garvey movement. He was a Jamaican-born Black nationalist and leader of a Pan-Africanism movement. He always liked to wear outlandish military-style uniforms in public. And he's advocating self-pride and pride in one's race. He's, extremely outspoken. He said he wanted to be the president of Africa. But what he's advocating, that you've got to remember, is separate but equal status for persons of African ancestry. He's preaching self-government, separation of the races, and the Back to Africa movement. He sought to establish this set of independent Black states around the world. Now, his influence would lead to later Black Pride movements, although some will he'll be involved in a scandal, and some will think he's somewhat of a demagogue. If you want to know more about him, I actually have a few links about him on the website as well. But know that he has, 2 million followers. He supported 30 Black-owned businesses and an entire steamship company that thought that he could successfully take every African American to Africa. But when he communicated with Liberia and said, I'm, here to be the president of Africa, they said, get out of here. So, interesting point to look into. But other experiences for African Americans that might be notable, as we discussed, you've got the Great Migration, and so you're seeing increasing opportunities in terms of education, higher wages, and you do see a growing Black middle class. You're also seeing internationally famous Black Americans, like this is Paul Robeson. He's very handsome. He was an actor, a civil rights advocate. He had petitioned the government to try to get lynching laws in place to eliminate it, and he was unsuccessful. But you do see that voting rights continue to be restricted, and Black communities are isolated, as we mentioned before. All right, now one other area where you see intolerance is in the nativism and immigration restriction of the time. So remember, after World War I, there's chaos in so much of Europe. And so there's a mass of refugees that are seeking entrance into the United States after the war. But the war leaves Americans with an anti-European, anti-foreign sentiment. So Congress decides to limit overseas immigration. Now, that I mentioned overseas immigration here specifically because employers did encourage Mexican and Canadian immigrants to fill jobs, so those numbers are increasing. But in terms of outside the North American, region, then they're trying to limit it as much as they can. So I think that this was a little bit confusing to people, and feel free to reach out to me if I can explain it further. But think of it this way: all Americans are immigrants, right? But most before 1890 were what you call WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people. But you see tons of people coming in the 1890s and the early 20th century. So in 1917, with this sentiment, immigration laws are created that required all immigrants to pass literacy tests, and it bans immigration from Asia and charges an immigration fee of $8. But by the time the year is over, they'd like to intensify this. So they create what's called a quota system, and it limits the total number of immigrants to 357,000. But also what it does is it says the number of people coming to the USA from any one country could not exceed 3% of the number from that country that were already living in the USA in 1910. So what that means is they're trying to keep the racial or ethnic or religious groups the same size. They wanted to keep it so that, say 2% of the population were from the Middle East in 1910. They wanted to make sure that in 1910, it was still only 2% of the population. Even if the population overall had increased, they wanted to make sure that they didn't become a majority, that they stayed only the proportion that they had been before. So, they say, if 20 million came to the country as immigrants, they wanted to make sure that still only 2% of the population was Middle Eastern. They didn't want to see a growing racial composition of minority ethnic or religious groups within society. And then in 1924, they actually intensify it further. They reduce the quota to 2% based on the census from 1890, because in 1890, obviously, versus 1910, you rewind 20 years, there's 20 less years of immigrants, so there's probably less Italians and Catholics and Russian Jews and people from the Middle East and all of that. So in 1929, the number of immigrants each year was actually reduced to 157,000, and immigration from Asia was blocked altogether. So this is, again, a huge reversal of the earlier attitude towards immigration compared to, the first 100 years of American history. So political tensions that are notable include the Red Scare. So remember, the Red Scare is the intense fear of communism and radical ideas. For those who are still confused, let me just give you a brief reminder about communism. Basically, it happens in steps. So when you say the term Marxism, you're talking about Karl Marx's idea of this multi-step process to create a better society. So he said a single political party would take control of the government, and that political party would be called the dictatorship of the proletariat. It would be a strong central government made up of the proletariat. The proletariat are the working people. The government would take ownership over all land and property in order to redistribute it. And this phase is called, according to Karl Marx, socialism, scientific socialism. Now, he argued that needs would prevail over wants, and that the community consciousness would prevail over the needs of the individual, and that people would start thinking like this: from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, which means that people would work as much as they could, and they would only take as much as they needed, and that this redistribution process would have rid the society of greedy people, and you would have taken them out if they got in the way. So eventually, he said this single authoritarian leadership would only regulate activities until it needed to. Eventually, a classless and completely equal society would emerge, and there would be no need for further government regulation or intervention, and they would step down. That's the idea of Karl Marx, and Marxists who try to implement that include like Vladimir Lenin, who in 1917 ushers in the Russian Revolution. Now, why is this idea so scary to Americans? Well, because the Bolshevik Party had been successful in taking over Russia in 1917, and they created the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It's called the USSR. Now, for communism to survive, Lenin and others believed it would have to be spread throughout the world. So a lot of people feel like inherently the ideas contradicted some shared American values and beliefs. So at the time, there's a fear of foreign ideas and influences, and this is an idea that emerges in Europe. They're also unlikely to reject the aspects of capitalism that had been valued for quite some time, like private ownership of land and business. A lot of people had moved to the United States because of property ownership. A lot of people also valued the idea of free choice, where to work, what to buy, how much to sell for, etc., and the individualism that goes with that. So that sort of choice is not available during that phase of scientific socialism as redistribution is occurring. And also, a lot of Americans like the idea of non-essential consumerism. You know, communism focused on needs versus wants, but a lot of Americans wanted to focus on wants, like unnecessary things like art, music, movies, etc. You know, this entertainment industry has been booming. So the other issues include, you know, just a really strong, from the beginning, from 1776, fear and distrust of authority and government, as well as the fear of losing First Amendment freedoms to a larger community goal. The other thing that happens is after 1917 up to 1921, Lenin's experiment with democracy had totally failed. Within 24 hours, when elections didn't go the way he wanted, it became a totalitarian run country. And catastrophic starvation would follow in those years from the economic policies that he put in place. Like something like 7 million people will die just in the period 1920 to 21. You'll see cannibalism. I mean, it's really horrifying, so much so that Lenin actually retreats from communism in 1921 and implements the new economic policy, but we'll talk about that later. So all of this leads to the Red Scare, where you see an increase in raids, arrests, deportations. All of this fuels concerns, and then things like labor strikes, workers' rights, unions are reacted to with tremendous fear. So you see a great example of the Red Scare in the famous and controversial trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. If you have questions about that, please let me know. Last thing on here, remember that there are quite a few people who feel this conflict between the urban and rural areas of the United States. A lot of people in the rural areas felt that their traditional beliefs and ideals were being challenged by those in the cities, and arguments develop over war, science, contradictions in the Bible, and you see a group of people that emerged known as fundamentalists, and they argued that God inspired the Bible, so it can't contain any contradictions or errors, and that the Bible is to be taken as literally true rather than as allegorical, and every story, they will argue, took place exactly as described. A famous preacher of the time is Billy Sunday. I'll show you a clip of him here.
Civilization and society rests on morals. Morals rest on religion. Religion rests on the Bible and faith in God and in Jesus Christ. The Bible doesn't condemn any man because of his wealth. The Bible says the man that don't provide for his family is worse than an infidel. According to our standard of gold and silver, Abraham was worth $1.5 billion. David was worth $3 billion. Solomon was worth $5 billion. Solomon could have hired Andrew Carnegie for a butler, J. Pierpont Morgan to cut his lawn, and Andrew Mellon for a chauffeur, and John D. to black his boots. America needs a tidal wave of the old-time religion. America needs to be taken down to God's bathhouse and the hose turned on her. And the time isn't far distant when the wheels of God's judgment are going to go sweeping through this old God-hating world. And I want to take a pledge in this audience to join me in a pledge that you will never rest until this old God-hating, Christ-hating, whiskey-soaked, Sabbath-breaking, blaspheming, infidel, bootlegging old world is bound to the cross of Jesus Christ by the golden chains of love.
There you go. So that's Billy Sunday, and he was mentioned in your reading as well. This controversy between the old and the new is also seen in the Scopes trial. If you want more help with this, let me know. Otherwise, you can go ahead and pause it here. But next up, I'll just ask you guys to watch part 2 of the 1920s video, which will just focus more on Prohibition, Al Capone, and the gangsters of the time, and just some brief notes about the economic developments, and then we'll get into the Great Depression. All right, thanks, guys. Bye.